Imagine sitting quietly on a park bench, just trying to find a moment of peace, when suddenly an entitled woman storms up and calls the police on you for simply existing. That's exactly what happened when a homeless man crossed paths with a woman we all call Karen. She was convinced she could control the space around her, but what unfolded left the entire park stunned and her reputation shattered. This story isn't just about entitlement. It's about dignity, truth, and what happens when the world finally sees through the lies. Stick around to hear how it all played out. And if you enjoy stories like this one, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more unbelievable real-life dramas. It was a bright afternoon in late spring, the kind of day when the sky looked impossibly wide and the air carried just the faintest sweetness of blooming flowers. The town's central park stretched out like a green oasis in the middle of the suburb, its paths winding through thick trees and open lawns where children kicked soccer balls, joggers moved in steady rhythm, and families claimed picnic spots with folded blankets and baskets. To most people, the park was a sanctuary, a place to escape from the constant hum of suburban schedules, a place to breathe. On a weathered wooden bench near the eastern path sat a man whose presence did not quite match the glossy backdrop of the park's weekend leisure. His clothes were old, the color faded from too many washes, or perhaps not enough. His jacket was too large for his frame, hanging on him like a borrowed shell. A small backpack rested by his side, its seams fraying, stuffed with the kind of necessities one carried when there was no home to return to at night. His hair was unkempt, streaked with gray, and his beard grew unevenly across his chin. He was not a frightening figure, nor loud, nor disruptive. In fact, his posture was almost apologetic. Shoulders drawn inward, eyes lowered, as though he were trying to shrink from the world's gaze. He had been there for most of the morning, occasionally sipping from a plastic water bottle, sometimes simply closing his eyes as though listening to the wind. People passed by, most without a second glance, their lives too full to pause. A few noticed him, perhaps felt a twinge of discomfort, but walked on. He was, for the most part, invisible until she arrived. Karen. She strode into the park with the kind of presence that demanded space without asking. Everything about her was sharp, the clack of her heels on the paved path, the rigid posture of her shoulders, the oversized sunglasses perched on her nose despite the scattered clouds overhead. Her hair, cut in a style that announced both money and maintenance, framed a face set in permanent dissatisfaction. She was the kind of woman whose voice carried farther than necessary, whose complaints could turn silence into tension in seconds. With a designer tote swinging from her arm and a coffee cup in hand, she scanned the park as if it were her personal property, a domain she had paid for through her taxes, her status, her presence. And then her eyes landed on him, the man on the bench. It began with a pause. She slowed her steps, her lips pressing into a thin line as she adjusted her sunglasses to look more directly. A wrinkle of disgust creased her brow. To her, he did not belong here. He was an interruption to the perfect picture she expected: children playing, manicured lawns, happy families. Instead, there he sat, a reminder of realities she preferred to ignore, realities she could not control. Karen's irritation simmered quickly, like water on the verge of boiling. She could have walked past. She could have ignored him the way most others did, but something in her, whether pride, entitlement, or a deep discomfort, would not let her. She marched closer, her heels snapping against the path, until she stood a few feet from the bench. "You!" she said sharply, her voice slicing through the gentle hum of the park. The man blinked, lifting his head slowly. His eyes were tired but not hostile, a muted shade of blue that seemed to have seen too many days like this. He said nothing, waiting, cautious. "Yes, you," she continued as though clarifying to a child. "What do you think you're doing here?" The man shifted slightly, his hands resting on his backpack. He opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure if an answer would matter. "This is a public park," Karen said, emphasizing the word public as though it meant exclusive. "Families come here, children play here, and you—" She waved her hand toward him with disdain. "You were making everyone uncomfortable." A jogger slowed nearby, frowning at the tone of her voice but continuing on, unwilling to intervene yet. The man finally spoke, his voice quiet, raspy from disuse. "I'm just sitting." "Just sitting?" Karen repeated as though the words were absurd. "You've been here all morning. Don't you have somewhere else to go?" The question landed heavier than she realized. Of course he didn't. That bench, for the moment, was the closest thing to somewhere he had. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said softly. Karen's lips curled into a sharp smile, the kind that lacked all warmth. "You are bothering people. You're bothering me. And if I'm uncomfortable, others must be too." She glanced around, hoping for nods of agreement, but most people quickly looked away, avoiding her gaze. For a brief moment, silence stretched between them. The man lowered his eyes again, hoping she would grow bored and leave. But Karen was not the kind of person who left things unfinished when she felt her authority was being challenged. She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound threatening without shouting. "Look, I don't know what your situation is, but you can't just sit around here all day. This isn't some shelter. This is a neighborhood park, and we don't want people like you hanging around." The words, "people like you," hung in the air, thick with judgment. The man's jaw tightened. He had heard it all before, on sidewalks, in doorways, in places where he tried to simply exist. Strangers with clean clothes and certain lives always seemed to feel entitled to tell him where he could or could not be. Still, he kept his voice calm. "I'm not hurting anyone." Karen scoffed. "Not yet. But I've read the stories. First it's sitting on a bench, then it's begging, then it's crime. We don't need that here. Not in this community." Her voice had grown louder, drawing attention now. Parents shifted uncomfortably on their picnic blankets. A group of teenagers whispered, pulling out their phones to discreetly record. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of confrontation. The man lowered his gaze again, unwilling to fight but unwilling to move. It was his small rebellion, his quiet stand against being erased. Karen, however, saw his silence as defiance. Her cheeks flushed with indignation. She was not used to being ignored, not used to her words failing to command obedience. "You know what?" she snapped. "Fine. If you won't leave, I'll make you leave. I'm calling the police." Her hand dove into her tote, pulling out her phone with a triumphant flourish, as though this act cemented her power. She began dialing, her voice already rehearsing the complaint she would deliver. The man sat still, his hands folded tightly, his breath steady but heavy. He had been through this before. Accusations, calls, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal for existing. He knew how this could end. Around them, the park shifted. Some people leaned closer, curiosity piqued. Others muttered disapproval under their breath, though not loud enough for Karen to hear. The teenagers angled their phones more directly, sensing drama worth capturing. Karen lifted the phone to her ear, her voice rising with dramatic urgency. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious man in the park. He's loitering, harassing people, making everyone uncomfortable. Yes, right now. Please hurry." The man closed his eyes. And the confrontation had only just begun. Karen held her phone like a weapon, her manicured nails tapping furiously against the screen as she connected to emergency dispatch. Her voice carried instantly, sharp and theatrical, drawing more attention from the people in the park. "Yes. Hello? I need police here right away," she announced, pacing in a small circle as if to perform her urgency. "There's a man here. He's just sitting on a bench, staring at people, making everyone uncomfortable. I don't feel safe. My children don't feel safe. None of us do. Her words sliced through the tranquil afternoon, disrupting the gentle background of laughter, birdsong, and rustling leaves. People who hadn't been watching before now turned their heads. Some frowned at the exaggeration, since she had no children with her and the man had hardly moved since morning. Still, Karen spoke with such authority that someone unfamiliar with the situation might believe her. The homeless man sat very still, his back pressed into the bench, hands folded on his lap. He had long ago learned that movement could be misinterpreted, that any sudden gesture might be twisted into aggression. His breathing was slow, steady, though inside his chest it felt heavy, pressing down like a stone. He had been here before, in other parks in other towns, when someone decided his presence was an offense. The accusations were always vague: loitering, looking suspicious, making others feel unsafe. Words that carried weight, not because of truth, but because of fear and prejudice. He could feel the cycle repeating: the call, the arrival, the questions, the humiliation. Karen continued into her phone, her voice growing louder, dramatizing every detail. He looks dangerous. I don't know if he has weapons. He's glaring at me. Yes, he's glaring, threatening me just by sitting there. Please send someone immediately. A murmur rose among the park-goers. A mother pulling her toddler along shook her head in disapproval. He wasn't doing anything, she whispered to her friend. Why is she making such a scene? Two teenagers, phones already out, exchanged glances. She's totally lying, one said, whispering while recording. This is gonna go viral. Nearby, an older man with a newspaper lowered it, his eyes narrowing at Karen. This is ridiculous, he muttered, though he stayed rooted to his bench. Years of seeing confrontation taught him not to interfere too quickly. Karen, oblivious to the growing disapproval around her, paced back and forth with the phone pressed to her ear. Her words tumbled out faster now, layering the story with details that hadn't happened. He stood up at me earlier. Yes, he did. He came right up, threatening me. He's harassing people who walk by. I saw it. Everyone's scared. The man on the bench flinched. She was lying so easily, so smoothly, and he knew from experience that lies like hers often held more weight than his truth. He wanted to protest, to shout. I never moved. I never spoke until she did. But he swallowed the words. Experience told him that shouting back only reinforced the image of aggression she was painting. Instead, he sat still, shoulders hunched, his silence both his shield and his cage. One of the teenagers whispered, We've got the whole thing on video. She's lying. Good, the other said. We'll show the cops when they come. For Karen, though, this was not about truth. It was about control. She could feel eyes on her, and she mistook them for admiration. In her mind, she was protecting her community, a self-appointed guardian who stood up when others were too timid. She pictured herself telling the story later, how she bravely confronted a dangerous man, how she called the authorities before anything worse could happen. The thought fueled her, made her stride taller, her voice stronger. Please hurry, she urged the dispatcher, adding a tremor to her tone as though on the verge of tears. I don't know how much longer I can keep him from causing trouble. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Ma'am, officers are on the way. Please remain calm and at a safe distance. Karen snapped her phone shut with a triumphant huff, tucking it back into her tote. She turned back to the man, folding her arms across her chest. There, she said loudly, ensuring her voice carried to everyone around. The police are coming. They'll deal with you. The man looked up at her slowly, his eyes tired, filled not with fear but with a deep, bone-weary resignation. I didn't do anything, he said softly. Karen laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Oh, you'll have your chance to explain that, but I've seen your kind before. Always the same story. I didn't do anything? Well, the police will see the truth. A nearby father, holding his daughter's hand, finally spoke up. Ma'am, with all due respect, he hasn't moved from that bench. I've been here an hour. He hasn't bothered anyone. Karen whipped her head toward him, her sunglasses flashing in the sunlight. Excuse me? Do you even have children? Because I do, and I don't want them exposed to this. She gestured dramatically toward the man on the bench. The father raised his brows. He's sitting quietly, that's all. Quietly plotting, you mean? Karen snapped. You think people like that just sit around for no reason? No, they wait, they watch, and then they act. Well, not on my watch. The father shook his head and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Karen stood taller, convinced his retreat was proof of her superiority. The homeless man closed his eyes again, retreating inward. He remembered other days like this, being told to leave doorsteps, being shooed from bus stations, being accused of theft simply because he was near when something went missing. His life was a constant negotiation with suspicion. Today was no different, except now a crowd was watching. He thought of the life he once had, a job in construction, a modest apartment, a rhythm of days filled with work and purpose. It had unraveled slowly, one lost paycheck, one injury, one bad break at a time. The descent into homelessness had not been dramatic. It had been a quiet erosion, like a rope fraying until it snapped. And now here he was, defined not by who he was, but by what others decided he must be. Karen's heels clicked impatiently against the pavement as she hovered, waiting for sirens. She looked around as if daring anyone to challenge her authority. Some people turned away, avoiding her gaze. Others glared openly, but she interpreted even those looks as envy or ignorance. Minutes stretched long, each second taut with tension. The man on the bench remained motionless, his hands clasped tightly, his breathing deliberate. The teenagers whispered excitedly, ready for the climax of the drama they were recording. Parents gathered their children a little closer, not from him, but from the conflict brewing. Karen broke the silence again, her voice pitched to Carrie. This is what happens when no one takes responsibility. People let the wrong kind hang around, and before you know it, the whole neighborhood goes downhill. Well, not here. Not on my watch. She repeated the phrase like a mantra. Not on my watch. It gave her a sense of control in a world where she feared losing it. She couldn't control the economy or politics or even her own household. But here, in this park, she could assert herself. The homeless man finally whispered, more to himself than to her. Why do you hate me so much when you don't even know me? Karen froze for a moment, caught off guard by the quiet honesty in his voice. But she recovered quickly, scoffing. Don't play the victim. That's your game, isn't it? Make people feel sorry for you so you can keep living like this. Well, it won't work on me. Her words stung, not because they were true, but because they were so far from it. He had never wanted pity. He wanted dignity, a chance, a place where he didn't have to justify existing. But people like her made even sitting feel like a crime. The murmur among the bystanders grew louder now. Whispers carried, phrases like, she's overreacting, he didn't do anything, and this is messed up, drifted through the crowd. But Karen stood firm, her hands on her hips, waiting like a queen, expecting her guard to arrive and carry out her decree. And then, faintly at first, the sound began, the distant wail of sirens. Karen's lips curved into a satisfied smile. Finally, she muttered. The man on the bench felt his stomach twist. He had been here before, too. Sometimes the police listened, sometimes they didn't. It depended on the officers, on the day, on the weight of prejudice versus compassion. He didn't know which way this would go, but he braced himself, preparing for humiliation. The sirens grew louder, closer, until the flashing lights appeared at the edge of the park. Karen straightened her posture, smoothed her blouse, and positioned herself near the path. ready to greet the officers with her version of the story. In her mind, she was the heroine of the moment, the vigilant citizen who had saved her community from danger. But the truth, waiting quietly on a weathered bench, told another story entirely, and soon the two narratives would collide. The wail of sirens cut through the peaceful afternoon, a sound that turned heads and silenced conversations across the park. Children paused mid-play, their laughter dissolving into quiet curiosity. Dogs perked their ears, tugging at leashes, and parents instinctively pulled their little ones closer. The once relaxed atmosphere shifted into a charged expectancy. Something was about to happen. Karen's posture stiffened with satisfaction. She adjusted her sunglasses, smoothed her blouse, and stepped into the center of the path as though preparing to greet honored guests. This was her moment. In her mind, she had taken control of a dangerous situation, and now the authorities would arrive to validate her fears, her words, her authority. She already pictured herself telling the story later over wine with her friends, basking in their admiration. Karen, the one who stood up when no one else dared. The homeless man, meanwhile, sat frozen on the bench, his body tense, heart pounding against his ribcage like a drum. He had seen this scene before, different parks, different towns, but always the same rhythm. A call, a siren, officers approaching, questions asked with suspicion already baked in. His palms grew damp against his fraying backpack strap. He wasn't afraid of the police themselves, not exactly, but of the weight of Karen's lies, of how easily words like hers tipped scales against men like him. The flashing red and blue lights reflected across the trees as a patrol car rolled slowly up the narrow service lane. The hum of its engine seemed to magnify the tension already hanging in the air. The car stopped just a few yards from Karen, who immediately raised her arm and waved as though she were flagging down old friends. "Officers! Over here!" she called, her voice shrill with urgency. Two officers stepped out, one older, broad-shouldered with a calm face lined by years of service. The other younger, tall and watchful, scanning the scene with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They adjusted their belts, radios crackling softly at their sides, and walked toward the waiting crowd. Karen hurried forward to meet them, heels clacking decisively against the pavement. She gestured dramatically toward the bench. "That's him," she announced, pointing at the homeless man as though unmasking a criminal. "That's the one I called about. He's been harassing people, threatening me, making everyone in the park uncomfortable. I told you on the phone he's dangerous." The older officer raised a hand, his tone steady. "Ma'am, let's slow down. We'll sort this out. Can you step aside while we speak to him?" Karen frowned, momentarily thrown off by his evenness. "Of course. But you should know he glared at me, came right up to me, and I was terrified. I have children, you know. I can't let them be exposed to that." The younger officer glanced at her, then back at the man on the bench. The man hadn't moved, still seated with his hands resting visibly in his lap, shoulders slouched inward. His eyes lifted slowly to meet the officer's, calm but heavy with resignation. "Sir," the older officer said, approaching the bench with deliberate care. "Can we talk to you for a moment?" The man nodded, his voice quiet. "Of course." "Name?" "Daniel," he replied, his tone low but steady. "Daniel, are you carrying any weapons?" He shook his head. "No, sir. Mind if we check your bag?" Daniel hesitated, then slid his backpack forward, opening the zipper with slow, careful movements. Inside was little more than a folded blanket, a water bottle, a book worn at the edges, and a pair of socks. No weapons, no threat, just the bare essentials of survival. The younger officer leaned closer, inspecting briefly before nodding to his partner. The older officer closed the bag gently and handed it back. Karen, watching from a few feet away, grew impatient. She stepped forward again. "Officers, you're not taking this seriously enough. He's been sitting here all day, watching people, plotting who knows what. I told you he scared me half to death. Why aren't you—" The officer held up a hand to silence her. "Ma'am, we're handling it." Karen's jaw tightened. She wasn't used to being brushed aside. The older officer turned back to Daniel. "Sir, have you spoken to this woman before today?" Daniel shook his head. "No, she came up to me. I didn't say anything until she started yelling." "Did you threaten her?" "No," he said firmly, though his voice trembled slightly. "I was just sitting, that's all." Before the officer could continue, one of the teenagers who had been recording finally spoke up. "He's telling the truth," the boy said loudly. "We've got the whole thing on video. She started it. He didn't do anything." Heads turned. The crowd murmured. The boy held up his phone, the screen glowing with evidence. Karen whipped around, glaring daggers at the teenager. "Excuse me? You don't know what you saw. Children these days, always making videos instead of paying attention." But the younger officer gestured for the phone. "Can we see that?" The boy nodded eagerly, stepping forward to show the footage. The video was clear. Daniel sitting silently, Karen approaching with aggression, her voice sharp, her accusations unfounded. The officers exchanged a glance. Karen's face flushed. "That video doesn't show everything. He was glaring, threatening me without words. You can't capture that on a screen." The older officer sighed, patience thinning. "Ma'am, so far we haven't seen evidence that he's committed any crime." Karen sputtered. "Are you serious? He's homeless. He doesn't belong here. That's crime enough." The words slipped out before she realized how damning they sounded. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A mother on a picnic blanket stood, shaking her head. "You called the cops just because he doesn't have a home? That's disgusting." Karen's composure cracked. She waved her arms wildly, her voice rising. "You don't understand. This is how neighborhoods fall apart. First one shows up, then more, and suddenly it's unsafe to even come here." The younger officer's eyes hardened. "Ma'am, being homeless is not a crime. Calling us under false pretenses is a serious matter." Daniel lowered his gaze, the sting of her words cutting deep even as the officers defended him. He had long grown accustomed to being invisible, but days like this reminded him that sometimes being visible was worse. Karen, however, refused to relent. She pointed at Daniel again. "So what? You're just going to let him sit here. What about my safety? What about the children? Doesn't that matter?" The older officer's voice was firm now, final. "Ma'am, your safety is not at risk from this man. What is at risk is wasting police resources on false reports. I suggest you calm down before this becomes about you." The crowd murmured again, some openly nodding. The teenagers smirked, still recording. The father who had walked away earlier returned, arms crossed, shaking his head at Karen. Daniel sat quietly, his shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time since the officers arrived. He wasn't vindicated yet. He knew how quickly tides could turn. But for once, the truth seemed to be breaking through the fog of accusation. Karen, red-faced and sputtering, looked around for support, but the crowd's eyes were no longer sympathetic. The validation she had expected was gone, replaced by judgment. And for the first time, she realized she might have miscalculated. The police had arrived. The truth had arrived with them. And the balance of power was shifting. The park had fallen into an uneasy silence. The tension that had once radiated from Karen now hung in the air, like a storm that refused to break. Children whispered to their parents. Joggers slowed their pace, and even the birds seemed quieter, as though nature itself was waiting for the next moment. Karen stood rigid, arms folded, her face red beneath her sunglasses. Her composure, once flawless, had cracked into something brittle and defensive. She had expected applause, validation, gratitude. Instead, she found herself staring at skeptical eyes, shaking heads, and the persistent recording lenses of smartphones. Daniel remained on the bench, his body still, though a flicker of relief stirred beneath the weight of exhaustion. For once, he wasn't being dragged away. accused without evidence, or dismissed before he could even speak. The officers had listened, not fully, not completely, but enough to see through Karen's performance. It was a rare victory, though fragile, and he clung to it quietly. The older officer cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Ma'am," he said firmly, his tone carrying the authority of someone used to ending disputes. "We've reviewed the footage. We've spoken to witnesses. There is no evidence that this man has done anything wrong." Karen's mouth fell open. "No evidence? What about me? What about how I feel? Does that not matter anymore?" The younger officer, arms folded across his chest, replied calmly but firmly. "Feelings don't make a crime. Facts do." Gasps rippled through the crowd, some of amusement, some of relief. A mother sitting on a picnic blanket clapped softly, unable to hide her approval. The teenagers snickered, one muttering, "Oh, she's getting roasted." Karen whirled on them. "Shut up! You don't understand. You weren't the one in danger." "Danger from what?" one of the boys shot back, emboldened. "From him sitting on a bench? From him minding his own business?" Karen sputtered, searching for words, but they scattered like leaves in the wind. He looked at me. That's intimidation." The older officer pinched the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, I'm going to be very clear. Filing a false report is a serious offense. You claimed this man harassed and threatened you. The evidence says otherwise." Karen's voice rose to a shriek. "So you're taking his side? A homeless man over a taxpayer? Over a mother? Over me?" The younger officer's jaw tightened. "We're not taking sides. We're enforcing the law. And right now, it looks like the only person who broke it is you." The crowd buzzed with murmurs, people leaning closer, some raising their phones higher to catch every word. The story had shifted completely. The once villainized man on the bench was now cast in a different light. Dignified, calm, quietly resilient. Karen, once the self-appointed guardian, now looked less like a protector and more like an aggressor. Daniel sat still, his hands folded, his eyes lowered. Inside, his heart swelled with conflicting emotions. Vindication, yes, but also sadness. He hadn't wanted this scene. He hadn't wanted to be the center of spectacle or pity. He just wanted to sit, to rest, to be left alone. Yet here it was, unfolding in front of him, his story dragged into the open without his consent. The older officer turned to him gently. "Daniel, is there anywhere you're heading tonight? Any services you're connected to?" Daniel hesitated, embarrassed by the question being asked in front of the crowd. "I go by the shelter sometimes, when they've got space." The officer nodded, sympathetic. "All right. I can give you information for resources in town. Hot meals, showers, maybe some transitional housing. Would that help?" Daniel's throat tightened. Kindness was a rare currency, and when it came, it always caught him off guard. He nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Karen let out a derisive laugh. "Unbelievable. You're rewarding him? You're going to give him help after everything? What about me? What about my trauma?" The younger officer shot her a sharp look. "Ma'am, the only trauma here is the one you tried to create." That line hit like a hammer. The crowd erupted, not in cheers exactly, but in audible approval. Chuckles, murmured, "About time," and one or two claps. Karen's composure crumbled fully now. She removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes wet with angry tears. "You don't get it," she hissed, her voice cracking. "People like him are the reason neighborhoods go downhill. First they sit on benches, then they take over doorways, then there's crime, drugs, filth. I was stopping it before it started. And this is the thanks I get?" The older officer's face hardened. "No, ma'am. What you did was call 911 for a situation that wasn't a crime. You wasted emergency resources, you endangered someone's dignity, and you disrupted this entire park." Karen's voice faltered. "But You, he cut in, need to understand that your perception does not equal reality, and it certainly does not give you authority over who gets to use public spaces. The humiliation was unbearable. Karen turned in a frantic circle, seeking allies in the faces of the crowd, but found none. Where she expected agreement, she saw disapproval. Where she expected support, she saw judgment. Even the children seemed to look at her with confusion, their innocence piercing through her entitlement. The teenagers whispered gleefully, "She's done. This is going straight online." Karen snapped at them. "Delete that right now." "Freedom of speech," one quipped, grinning. The younger officer spoke again. "Ma'am, consider this your warning. Next time you file a false report like this, you will face charges. Do you understand?" Karen's lips trembled. She wanted to protest, to scream, to reclaim the control slipping from her like sand through her fingers. But the words died in her throat. She nodded stiffly, her pride burning hotter than the sun overhead. "Good," the officer said flatly. For a moment, silence returned. The drama was ending, though its echoes would last long after the crowd dispersed. Daniel, still seated, let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He felt lighter, though the weight of his reality remained. Homelessness didn't vanish with one confrontation. But dignity had been restored, if only a little, and that mattered. The older officer crouched slightly, meeting Daniel's eyes. "You're free to stay here as long as you like. This park is for everyone." Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. "Thank you." The officers turned to leave, the crowd slowly breaking apart into smaller conversations. Some approached Daniel briefly. One man offered him a bottle of water, another pressed a few bills discreetly into his hand. A mother encouraged her daughter to wave shyly at him, and he smiled back, soft and genuine. Karen stood frozen, her pride in ruins. She wanted to scream at the crowd, to insist that she had been right, that everyone else was blind. But the weight of disapproval crushed her. Her reputation, once polished and commanding, now felt fragile. She gathered her tote bag, adjusted her sunglasses, and stormed out of the park, her heels clacking like a retreating drumbeat. The crowd watched her go, then turned back to their lives, the park slowly resuming its rhythm. Laughter returned. Dogs barked. Soccer balls rolled across the grass. The world, it seemed, had not ended because a homeless man sat on a bench. It had only been interrupted by the storm of one entitled woman. Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the warmth of the sun settle against his face. For once, he felt seen. Not as a threat, not as a problem, but as a person. And that was worth more than anything Karen had tried to take away. The unexpected outcome was clear. She had called the police to erase him. Instead, she had exposed herself. And the story of Karen versus the homeless man would not be forgotten. Not by the crowd who witnessed it, not by the phones that recorded it, and not by Daniel, who, for once, had found a measure of justice.